Look at what's happening in Gaza right now. People. Defined, documented, recognized people with names and histories and family trees going back centuries are being removed from their land. And the justification, at its core, is always the same. It comes dressed in different language depending on the century. Sometimes it's religion, sometimes it's security, sometimes it's progress, but strip it all away and the argument underneath never really changes. These people don't deserve what they're sitting on. I'm not going to do a full episode on Palestine today, but I need you to hold that image, hold the shape of it, because what I'm about to tell you is 100 years old, and it is the same shape. Different land, different people, different names, same machinery. I'm Adam, your favourite imaginary narrator, and this is the Retrospect. The story I'm telling today is set in Oklahoma, in the 1920s, among a people called the Osage, and what happened to them is one of the most disturbing, most meticulously concealed, and most revealing crimes in American history. Here's the thing historians always miss about this. The Osage murders weren't just murders. They were a system, a machine built specifically to take wealth from people the powerful had already decided didn't deserve it. And the genius, if you want to call it that, of the machine was that it wore a human face. It wore the face of a neighbour, a friend, a husband. Let that sink in for a second. The people who came to kill the Osage didn't invade. They didn't march in with flags and uniforms. They moved in next door. They sat at dinner tables. They held hands at church. And some of the men who murdered Osage people for money, did it while lying in bed next to Osage wives. This is the story of the Osage Reign of Terror. And it starts, like all American tragedies, with oil. It's the late 1800s. You're Osage, and that means your people have already been through it once, already been driven from your ancestral land in Kansas at gunpoint and pushed into what everyone at the time called Indian Territory. A patch of rocky, hilly, seemingly useless land in northeastern Oklahoma. And here's the thing about that land. The US government gave it to the Osage precisely because they thought it was worthless. The logic was brutal and simple. Give the Indians the land nobody wants. Limestone outcroppings, dense brush, hard soil. No good for farming, no good for grazing, no good for anything. The Osage took it. They had no real choice, but they were smart enough to insist on one thing when they accepted the reservation. They demanded ownership of the mineral rights. Anything under the soil, it was theirs forever. The US government agreed, because again, who cared? It was worthless land. And then, in 1897, they struck oil. Not just a little oil, not a modest discovery. They struck one of the most spectacular oil reserves in the entire country, sitting directly under what everyone had written off as useless wasteland. Almost overnight, the Osage Reservation became the most valuable patch of real estate in America, maybe in the world. Think about what that means. Imagine you're poor, you've been marginalized, you've been shoved to the edges, and then the ground under your feet turns into gold. Not metaphorical gold, actual, gushing, industrial era gold. Liquid gold, black gold. By the early 1920s, the Osage Nation was receiving oil royalties that made them, per capita, the wealthiest group of people on the entire planet. Not just the wealthiest Native Americans, the wealthiest people, period, anywhere. Osage families were buying automobiles when most of white America still rode horses. They were hiring white servants. They were wearing Paris fashions. They were building homes with grand parlours. One Osage woman, a woman named Lizzie Q, reportedly had an income that would be equivalent to millions of dollars a year today. Now, I want you to notice something. Notice the reaction this provoked, because it tells you everything. White Americans, many of them, were furious. Not impressed, not congratulatory, furious. The language in newspapers of the time is jaw-dropping. There were editorials complaining that the Osage were wasting their money, that they didn't know how to handle it, that it was somehow wrong, somehow unnatural, that these people, these Indian people, had more than white people did. The US government stepped in with something called the guardianship system. Under this system, Osage people with too much money were assigned white legal guardians, white men, who had the legal authority to control their finances. Let me say that again so it lands correctly. The United States government looked at the wealthiest people in the country and said, these people need white men to manage their money for them. Not because they were incapable, the Osage were perfectly capable, but because the alternative, accepting that indigenous people could simply have things, was apparently intolerable. The guardians stole, systematically. Osage people were often given a small allowance from their own fortunes, while their appointed guardians pocketed the rest. And this was legal. This was the system. But even the guardianship system wasn't enough for some people, because the Osage had something called head rights. A head right was essentially your share of the tribal oil royalties. Every enrolled Osage member had one. And here's the crucial detail. Head rights were inheritable. If an Osage person died, their head right passed to their heirs. Think about what that creates. It creates an incentive, a financial incentive, a very, very powerful one for Osage people to die, and for the people who stood to inherit from them to make sure they did. Enter a man named William K. Hale. Hale was a cattle rancher, white, from Texas originally. He'd moved into Osage County in the early 1900s and built himself up into a prosperous, well-connected, well-liked pillar of the community. The Osage called him King of the Osage Hills. He spoke a little of their language. He attended their ceremonies. He seemed to respect them. He certainly smiled at them. He smiled at everybody. Hale was the kind of man who knew everyone's name, who sent gifts on birthdays, who showed up to funerals and laid a hand on your shoulder. He was, by all accounts, enormously charming. The word that keeps coming up in descriptions of him is powerful, not in a violent sense, but in the way that certain people make a room feel like they run it without doing anything obvious to earn that feeling. He also secretly orchestrated one of the most extensive serial murder conspiracies in American history. This is the thing about William Hale that is almost too chilling to sit with. He didn't just decide to kill one person for money. He built a system for killing. He identified the Osage and their head rights as an opportunity, the way a businessman identifies a market. And he set about exploiting that opportunity with the patience and the deliberateness of a long-term investment strategy. His first move was his nephew, a young man named Ernest Burkhart. Hale encouraged Burkhart, perhaps engineered it, to court and marry an Osage woman from a prominent family. Her name was Molly Kyle. Now, I want to be clear about something here, because it would be easy to reduce Molly Kyle to a victim and nothing else. She was a real person, a woman of genuine dignity and grace. She was also, by many accounts, a woman who loved her husband, who believed in the life they were building together, who had no idea what was happening around her, even as the people closest to her began one by one to disappear. Molly's family was wealthy. Her mother, her sisters, her relatives, multiple head rights concentrated in one family. If those people died and their head rights passed down, and eventually they all concentrated in Molly. And Molly's husband was Ernest. Then Ernest's uncle William Hale stood to become extraordinarily rich. You see the machine now? It's May 1921. A woman named Anna Brown, Molly's sister, goes missing. When they find her, she's in a ravine, shot in the back of the head. 3 weeks later, Molly's mother, a woman named Lizzie Q, begins to decline. She'd been healthy. Now she's deteriorating, losing weight, in persistent pain. The doctors can't explain it. She dies that summer, within months. Then Molly's cousin Charles Whitehorn is found dead, shot. Also, May 1921. These deaths are noted, they are concerning, but they're not yet a pattern, or rather, the pattern isn't being looked for. Because who looks for a pattern when the victims are Osage and the sheriff is a white man in a white county in 1920s Oklahoma? And then there's an explosion. In March 1923, in the middle of the night, a house in Fairfax, Oklahoma, is destroyed by a bomb. Inside, a man named Bill Smith, Osage, his wife Rita, another of Molly's sisters, and their white servant Nettie Brookshire, who happened to be sleeping there. All three killed, the house reduced to splinters. This was no longer deniable, an explosion, in the night, in a residential neighbourhood. And here's the thing historians always miss about this. Even after the explosion, the local investigations went nowhere. Not because the investigators were incompetent, some of them were, but more because Osage County, in 1923, was thoroughly in the pocket of William Hale. He had connections to the sheriff, to local prosecutors, to witnesses who would say whatever he needed them to say. The investigation was strangled before it could breathe. The Osage were watching the people they loved die around them, and the legal system, the system that was supposed to protect them, was the instrument being used against them. The Osage Nation eventually did something remarkable. They hired their own private investigators, multiple times. And multiple times, those investigators either failed or were bought off, or, in at least one case, ended up dead. Think about that. You are watching your family be murdered. You are spending your own money to investigate, and the investigation itself becomes a target. What do? Eventually, through the Osage's persistent lobbying, the case reached the doorstep of a relatively new federal agency, one that was trying very hard to establish itself as legitimate, trying to prove it had the reach and the competence to handle exactly this kind of case. The Bureau of Investigation, soon to be renamed the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover is a name most people know, and in 1923 he was the relatively new director of the Bureau of Investigation, trying to reshape it into something modern and professional and, crucially, nationally prominent. The Osage murders were, for Hoover, an opportunity. If the Bureau could crack a case that local law enforcement had completely failed on, a sensational case involving wealth and murder and oil, it would be a defining moment. It would prove the Bureau was necessary. So Hoover assigned an agent named Tom White to lead the investigation. Tom White is one of the people in this story I have genuine affection for. He was a tall Texan, former lawman, quiet and methodical, the kind of agent who went undercover, actually undercover, not just wearing a hat, operating in Osage County for months, building relationships and trust before making a move. White and his team embedded themselves in the community. Some posed as cattle buyers, some as insurance salesmen. They gathered information slowly, carefully, the way you gather kindling, and what they found piece by piece was staggering. The number of Osage who had been killed, the full scope of it. It wasn't just the murders connected to the Burkhart and Kyle families. When investigators started pulling on the thread, they found dozens of suspicious deaths going back years. Osage people who had died of mysterious illnesses, who had fallen off horses at convenient moments, who had been shot under circumstances that were explained away. The doctors who had examined some of these deaths had missed, or chosen not to notice, signs of poisoning. Arsenic, slowly administered in food, in drink, over weeks and months. A particularly insidious method, because arsenic poisoning in its early stages looks like illness. The kind of illness that kills people in that era without raising much alarm. Molly's mother, Lizzie Q, the prolonged decline, the mysterious pain, the doctor's bafflement. She had been poisoned, slowly, deliberately, by someone in her household. And here is the detail that will stay with you. Molly herself, the woman at the centre of all this, the woman whose family was being systematically eliminated around her. By the end of the investigation, Molly too was showing symptoms, hair loss, weakness. Persistent illness. Molly was being poisoned by her own husband, Ernest, the man she loved, the man she had children with. While she was grieving the deaths of her sisters, while she was frightened, while she was trying to figure out what was happening to her family, her husband was poisoning her. Let that land. Now, this is where historians don't always agree, and I think it's worth talking about. The trial of William Hale and Ernest Burkhart eventually happened. Hale was convicted of the murder of Henry Rowan, one of Molly's relatives, found shot in his car in February 1923 and sentenced to life in prison. Ernest Burkhart cooperated with investigators, testified against his uncle, and received a lighter sentence. He was eventually pardoned. But here's what the trial didn't address: the full scope of the murders, the dozens of other Osage deaths that investigators suspected were connected, deaths that happened before the Bureau got involved, deaths where the evidence had been buried or burned or bribed away. Those deaths were never prosecuted. The people responsible for many of them, the other men Hale had hired, the local officials who had looked the other way, the doctors who had signed off on suspicious death certificates, most of them were never charged with anything. The official narrative, the one the FBI later promoted, was a story of heroic investigation. J. Edgar Hoover made sure of that. The Bureau used the Osage case as its founding myth, the case that proved federal law enforcement was necessary and effective. And in doing so, they told a much cleaner version of the story than the actual one. The actual story is that the Bureau solved a fraction of what happened. The machine was larger than any one conspiracy, and the machine, the fundamental machinery of dispossession, the head-right system and the guardianship system, and the legal frameworks that allowed white men to profit from Osage deaths, that machinery wasn't dismantled, it just quietly stopped being newsworthy. And here's what I actually think about this, because I do have a take. The way this story gets told, when it gets told at all, tends to focus on William Hale as the villain, the mastermind, the monster, and Hale was certainly monstrous. But treating him as a singular monster actually lets everyone else off the hook. It turns a systemic crime into a personal one. It says, there was one very bad man, and now he's in prison and the system worked. That is a lie. A comfortable lie, but a lie. William Hale didn't operate in a vacuum. He operated in a county where the sheriff was his ally, in a state where the courts could be managed, in a country where the legal infrastructure, the guardianship system, the head-right laws, the definition of who counted as a competent adult, had been specifically designed to transfer wealth from Osage people to white people. Hale just took that infrastructure and accelerated it. He pushed it to its logical extreme. And the thing that connects this to the image I opened with, the image from Gaza, from Palestine, is this. The machinery of dispossession doesn't require monsters. It runs on ordinary people making ordinary decisions. The lawyer who approves the guardianship, the doctor who signs the death certificate without asking too many questions, the neighbour who sees something suspicious and decides it's not his business, the journalist who doesn't run the story because the victims aren't the kind of people that readers will care about. The monster is useful to the story because the monster can be removed and the story ends. But when the system is the problem, there's no single removal that fixes it. There's another detail in this story that I can't stop thinking about. Molly Kyle Burkhart, after everything, after her sisters were murdered, after her mother was slowly poisoned, after she herself was being poisoned by her husband, Molly survived. She recovered. She divorced Ernest Burkhart. She remarried an Osage man. She lived to see her former husband imprisoned, and she spent the rest of her life watching the land that was supposed to be permanently her people's, permanently theirs, by treaty, by law, by every promise the United States had made, slowly slipping away through other mechanisms. Legal mechanisms, slow, grinding, bureaucratic mechanisms that didn't require explosions in the night. She died in 1937. The oil was still flowing. The head rights were still being inherited by fewer and fewer Osage hands. David Gran, the journalist who spent years researching this story, eventually discovered something else when he dug into the historical record. The number of suspicious Osage deaths in the early 20th century was far larger than what made it to trial. He found evidence suggesting the murder campaign may have claimed dozens of victims, perhaps more than 100. In the years before the Bureau even showed up, 100 people murdered for oil, for head rights, for land, and the historical record had essentially swallowed them. Here's the thing historians always miss about this. History isn't just what gets recorded. It's what gets believed worth recording. Whose deaths count, whose losses register. The Osage murders were happening for years before they became a case, before they had a name, before they were worthy of federal attention. And in those years, in that silence, families were destroyed and wealth was transferred, and the machine did its work unchallenged. The victims of the Osage Reign of Terror were not invisible. They were seen. They were just not considered worth the effort of saving. And here's what I actually think. The Osage story is not a story about the past. It is not a cautionary tale about a more primitive era. It is a template, a blueprint that has been used and reused and is being used right now, in different geographies, in different languages, with different paperwork. The logic is always the same. Find a group of people, find what they have, decide they don't deserve it, then use the law, use marriage, use inheritance, use legitimate seeming legal structures to extract it. And when the law isn't fast enough, use violence, but make the violence deniable. Make it look like illness, like accident, like misfortune. And if it can't be made to look like misfortune, make sure the investigation goes nowhere. Make sure the prosecutors are friendly. Make sure the witnesses are scared. And when it's done, when the transfer is complete, write the history in a way that makes the victims sound like they were simply unlucky, or not ready to manage what they had, or culturally incompatible with the demands of modernity. Here's what nobody wants to say out loud. The Osage and the Palestinians are not two different stories. They are one story, told twice, in different accents, 100 years apart. Same logic, same playbook, same opening move. Find a group of people, find what they're sitting on, and then construct a legal architecture so elaborate, so bureaucratic, so drowning in paperwork and permits and official-sounding language, that by the time anyone calls it what it is, the transfer is already done. The Osage were handed worthless land until the oil came up. The Palestinians sit on some of the most strategically valuable coastline in the Middle East, with natural gas reserves offshore that most Western news coverage somehow never gets around to mentioning. And in both cases, both of them, the dispossessors didn't arrive as conquerors in uniform. They arrived as neighbours, as settlers building houses and planting gardens and saying with a completely straight face that they were simply living there. The violence, when it came, wore civilian clothes, and when those civilians met any form of resistance, they hid behind legal documents, behind justice systems, behind the machine. That's the thing about the machine. It doesn't just take your land, it takes your version of events first. Because if your story isn't credible, your loss isn't real. And if your loss isn't real, well, the machine can keep running. The Osage knew exactly what was happening to them. They hired investigators. They lobbied Congress. They wrote letters. They preserved records. They remembered. The thing that was taken from them wasn't just money and oil and lives. The thing that is always taken first, before anything else, is the right to have your own version of events be believed. We are watching, right now, in real time, people fight for exactly that, the right to be believed, the right to have their version of events, their deaths, their losses, their history counted. The Osage Reign of Terror happened 100 years ago, and it still doesn't have a prominent place in the curriculum of American schools. The victims don't have monuments. Most Americans, if you stopped them on the street, could not name a single person who died in it. But the oil companies still operate in Oklahoma. The money was made, the machine worked. That's the history. And the reason history matters is because the machine is still running. Somewhere, right now, people who have something valuable are being told, through the law, through violence, through the quiet machinery of dispossession, that they don't deserve it. The names change, the machine doesn't.